Chapter 16, Discord 3-3. Chapter 8, Discord 3-3, 1994, 1995. Percy is 18 and 31, Harry is 14, and Severus is 34. And Voldemort is trapped in the form of a child. March 1995, with Myrtle in mind. Percy spends much of Monday afternoon contemplating Crouch's dark head as its bearer strides in and out of the office. Crouch looks the same as Percy remembers, his appearance scrupulously correct, if one ignores the sometimes manic light in his eyes as he shouts over the flue to the unlucky Sard on the other end, his mustache neatly combed and hair carefully parted, and his robes always of fine quality and in dark, somber colors. Enchanting the parchment in front of him, Percy begins to compile a list, struggling to marshal his tired, chaotic thoughts into something reasonable. Scenario 1. Crouch has gone mad. This had been the official line in the previous timeline. Percy remembers that well, albeit with some residual indignant guilt. Fudge himself had personally questioned Percy when Crouch began to miss several of his major obligations, made several insulting claims that Percy was ignoring Crouch's obvious ill health out of the opportunistic desire to take over more of his role, and then taken over judging at the third task without so much of a how do you do. He'd apologized to Percy after of sorts. After Percy had begun working with Fudge, the minister had revealed that Crouch had gone mad and attacked two of the champions sometime before the third task. Couldn't have seen it coming, Fudge had said gruffly, playing nervously with his own mustache, which Percy had taken as an admission of their shared guilt in the matter. In this timeline, Percy has been paying much closer attention to Crouch, and while the other man is acting erratically, Percy does not think he is mad. Certainly he's been more active in the ministry, though Percy has noticed his focus is more on the tournament than anything else. If Crouch is mad, there's nothing much for Percy to do except for stay quiet and try and contain whatever damage the man may cause. Scenario 2. Crouch is being poisoned. Percy privately feels that this may be likely, given that Crouch is showing clear signs of ill health consistent more with poison than with mere sickness. Certainly his face is often damp, and his health seems to ebb and flow more erratically than a consistent illness. But it lays two questions, of course. Who would be poisoning Crouch, and why? Percy feels like it must be connected to Diggory, or Bagman, or the Goblins, or the tournament, perhaps to all four. But he cannot think who may have something to gain from poisoning Crouch. Certainly the unknown actor was comfortable outright murdering Diggory. Why leave Crouch alive? Why would Crouch not take action if he can sense himself being poisoned? Which unfortunately brings Percy to Scenario 3. Crouch is being imperiused, or otherwise controlled. This would explain some of the unpredictable behavior, as well as explain why someone would take the risk of attacking Crouch. Perhaps the actor wants information from Crouch about any of the above topics, or they want Crouch to interfere. Perhaps it is Lucius, or Bagman himself, or Rookwood either poisoning or commanding Crouch. How could Percy tell? Imperius does leave a trace. Percy had suspected for months that Pewes may be cursed in the original timeline, though of course by then he had put his head down and said nothing. Imperius is not the same as true possession. It necessitates some of the person's own soul remains unfettered to act. It is a spell of compulsion, of dominance. The imperiused person almost always fights back. They have glassy eyes and a subservient attitude. Sometimes Percy would talk to Pewes, and Pewes would stand quietly while the spell stalled on how he should respond to a given command. Their movements are more jerky and less refined. Imperius is also most certainly dark magic, and if there is one thing that Percy has learned studying dark magic this time around, it's that magic that is very dark or very light leaves traces. Percy does not think Crouch exhibits these symptoms, but someone imperiusing Crouch makes a lot more sense than just poisoning him. Perhaps Crouch is being intermittently cursed, unlike Pewes, who had been under a spell for many months. It would make the most sense for the unknown Death Eater to spell Crouch only when needed. If that is the case, then what should Percy do differently? Without knowing who or why may be cursing Crouch, Percy can't hope to feed the actor false information or divert his plans. In fact, what Percy thinks is the most likely is that that person wants to ensure Harry Potter wins the tournament and therefore is delivered to Voldemort. Perhaps Bagman, trying to deliver on a big promise for a big payout. Perhaps someone trying to frame Bagman and anger the goblins, thereby depriving the Ministry of their support in the upcoming war. If the person does want Harry Potter and Harry Potter alone to win the tournament, so does Percy. So perhaps he should do nothing and merely be watchful, ready to act when he needs. That Wednesday, as is tradition, Percy goes to his weekly art lesson at the Malfoys. He's nearly finished with the portrait of Arthur. It needs only the last few touches, and then it will be complete. Narcissa greets him at the door in the place of the house elf. "Let us stroll," she says, offering him her arm. Mr. Barrington will be a few minutes delayed. Percy takes it uncomfortably. She corrects his grip without comment, and they set off down the winding path of Malfoy Manor. "Tell me, Percy," says Narcissa calmly, as if they are discussing the weather. "Do you count yourself loyal to Dumbledore?" Percy stumbles over his own feet. Narcissa patiently waits for him to right himself and then continues forward, pulling Percy along. No," he says, hoping desperately that is the right answer. Narcissa hums, but does not respond with words. They continue to walk, the calm facade in direct contrast to the riotous turmoil in Percy's head. Narcissa Malfoy, for all the time in this timeline Percy has spent lightly chatting with her, is somewhat of a mystery. He knows she saves Harry at the very end by lying to the Dark Lord, but as far as he knows, she does that to save Draco, and not out of any loyalty to the light side. She must know, too, that the Dark Lord's return is imminent. Perhaps Pettigrew is sending out notes. Perhaps he has gained enough strength to communicate. Perhaps Malfoy has merely looked at his left arm and come to the same conclusion as Karkaroff and Snape. The time of reckoning is very soon. So what does she want from him? "Imagine my surprise when I learned that Nymphadora Tonks had written my son," she continues lightly. "I imagine you had something to do with that. Oh, perhaps this is nothing more than maternal concern regarding Tonks." "I did," he admits. "Indirectly. I mentioned to Tonks, Nymphadora, that you said Draco spoke highly of me. She thought that it was a bit of a pity she'd never gotten the chance to meet Draco, and she insisted on writing to him despite my protests. I would have mentioned it to you, my lady, had I thought you were not aware." "I see," Narcissa says. "Do you believe she is loyal to Dumbledore?" Tonks is at some point recruited into the Order. Percy knows that. But aside from her induction, he doesn't think she is particularly loyal to Dumbledore. Not in the same way that his parents are. "I don't think she has any sort of opinion on Dumbledore," he says truthfully. "And you approve of her?" "Yes," he says without hesitation. "I like to think Draco and I have much in common. I believe he and Nymphadora would similarly get along well, even though she is a half-blood." "Madame Tonks raised her according to her family traditions," says Percy, which is partially true and partially a generous exaggeration. Tonks certainly has been exposed to the black traditions, but it would be quite a mistake to say that she follows them unquestioningly. She is well brought up and very sensible. She can seem a bit rebellious, but I assure you that she acts with honor and is far from reckless. Narcissa makes a small, thoughtful noise and begins to turn them back toward the house. "I believe it would be in Draco's best interest to allow the correspondence to continue for now," she says. "Madame Malfoy, may I ask why you approve of me, even though my family is—" Percy trails off awkwardly. She raises a manicured eyebrow. "I have learned that family is not everything," she says, and though her tone is quiet, Percy senses a depth behind her words. "I believe your family has failed you, but I shall not hold that against you if you continue to live up to the potential you display." Percy doesn't even protest the notion that his family has failed him. If pressed, he may even say that he agrees. "Your regard is very valuable to me," he says instead, and inclines his head slightly. When they return to the parlor, Mr. Barrington is waiting for them, surveying Percy's progress. "I believe we shall finish today," he says, giving Narcissa a short bow. "Come, Mr. Weasley, we have no time to lose." Painting Tom on his own will be difficult, particularly as his coloring is very different to Arthur. Percy tries to commit everything to memory as his teacher instructs him in the correct way to apply paint to the canvas, the steps of the process, and the correct ordering of the details. He's decided to put Tom in the Slytherin common room, working off photographs of Tom and his friends in the earlier Hogwarts periodicals. He'll give him a set of bookshelves, which Tom's essence will hopefully fill with his academic knowledge, a globe on a table, which he hopes will trigger Tom's recollection of where the Horcruxes may be, and a Slytherin pennant to awaken perhaps his heritage to Salazar. Those details are easier to handle. What makes Percy cringe is the stress of actually working on the face, to try and bring light to the portrait's eyes and definition to the shadows. That's the part they're on for Arthur, and it already makes him feel as though he's facing an exam he knows he's going to fail. They finish the portrait within the hour. Barrington demonstrates the charm to enchant it. Percy breathes in, filling his mind with memories of his father, and casts the spell perfectly. Arthur blinks, looks around him, and then waves enthusiastically. They had given him a table with some metal gears to tinker on, and the portrait busies himself with them immediately. Without the potion or the wand-tipped brushes, that is all this version of Arthur will ever do. Percy, Narcissa, and Barrington all survey it in silence. "It's an excellent rendering," says Narcissa. "Very true to life." Indeed, Mr. Barrington had forced Percy to be as true to life as he possibly could. Even the way his father's left eyebrow tufts has been faithfully rendered. Percy feels odd, looking at his father's face staring out of the frame, so lifelike. If he had once perhaps thought that painting the man would give him insight into his life, well, Percy now knows better. The lines of his father's face gave him no map with which to navigate their relationship. Barrington nods, short and stern. Despite his utter inflexibility and strict adherence to the rules, qualities Percy can, in all honesty, respect, Barrington is rather likable. "Not quite a master's work, but a very solid attempt," he says. "My thanks to you, Lady Malfoy, for bringing this student to my attention." Narcissa laughs and rests a hand on Percy's shoulder. "My pleasure. The issue is, of course, what to do now. Percy's apartment is filled to the brim with sketches of Tom's face, but he's not yet had the courage to begin the long and laborious process of painting the portrait. And even with the generous rates Barrington has given him, Percy is having a hard time affording these weekly lessons, and Percy doesn't have an easy way to make more money with the Philosopher's Stone. Barrington, as usual, solves the problem in his neat, efficient way. "I'll be out of the country until December," he says. "I've been asked to take on the youngest Helavia as a pupil." Narcissa sniffs. "That'll be Tulip." She and Mr. Barrington share a mutual look filled with meaning that Percy is completely excluded from, though his relief tempers some of the burn. "Percival, I would like it if you continued to drop in on me," says Narcissa. "I have enjoyed our little chats." "I would be delighted, madam," Percy says quickly. He's not entirely sure why Narcissa has taken such an interest in him. He suspects it has something to do with his simultaneous proximity to Andromeda Tonks, Harry Potter, Severus Snape, and even Draco. But he's come to enjoy the air of refinement that even an hour of time with Narcissa instills into his life. He's even begun taking his tea at the ministry the same way. Hand carefully positioned, small pastries politely and discreetly consumed. Plus, Percy hasn't seen a single luminous hair of Lucius' head, which makes the whole endeavor feel a bit safer. That night, when he returns home, he covers the painting of Arthur with a sheet and turns to the canvas sitting untouched in his living room. For a second, the possibilities overwhelm him. Tom's face, rendered as carefully as Percy's father's, but infinitely more animated, more alive. Tom with his sly smirk and his cutting jokes, and the wealth of knowledge contained behind his dark blue eyes. Percy can admit he has missed Tom a little. He does not want to lie to himself. Tom is the only person that Percy has met, aside from Snape, maybe, with a mind so sharp and nimble that even to cross words with him is a pleasure. No, Percy has no trouble imagining young Tom ruling over Hogwarts with honeyed words and the mysterious allure of dark magic. Tom's descent into the Dark Lord was a prodigious waste of talent. Looking at the sketch he had completed of Tom, hanging next to the blank canvas for reference, Percy feels sad for him, this boy whose initial crime was to be better than his peers, and with an imagination to match. By 16, he'd committed a murder, but by 16, it was already far too late for him. Dumbledore had failed him, Percy thinks to himself, continuing to stand in the middle of his small living room. Dumbledore had failed Tom like he had failed Percy, like he had failed Charlie and Bill, like he will fail Draco Malfoy and Ron, and maybe even Harry himself. Dumbledore was entrusted with the well-being and success of the bright young minds of the wizarding world, and he fails them without guilt, and they turn to alternate paths, Egypt, Romania, the dark arts, for fulfillment. Percy sighs and picks up the large brush he will use to glaze the canvas first. He won't fail Tom, at least the 11-year-old boy that he can imagine arriving at Hogwarts for the first time. In his heart, something like awe and half-buried hope. He won't fail the 16-year-old Tom either, or the version of Tom that he could have been at 16, if he had not already hardened that heart to the world. He cannot allow himself to forget that 16-year-old Tom was already a murderer, Percy tries to remind himself as he spreads the beige glaze across the large canvas. Although technically the basilisk had killed Myrtle, perhaps it is the sentimentality in Percy, but he cannot help but believe that Tom could have been saved if someone had traveled back in time to the 1940s and gently led him down a different path. Who had been the second person that Tom had killed? The first he'd killed with his own hands, his own wand, his own spell. His father, perhaps, or his uncle, the elderly Smith woman. Why does it matter if I killed all of them in the end? Tom's voice whispers in his head. Percy pauses, some of the glaze dripping off his brush and into his rug. He murmurs a spell absently to evaporate the mess. He supposes it does not really matter, of course, but thinking of Tom's family had just reminded him that he is not entirely sure if Morphin Gaunt is still alive. When he looks into it, the next day at work, casting a shielding charm over the documents he'd surreptitiously copied from the archives early in the morning, he finds two very interesting facts. One, that Morphin Gaunt died early last year and buried in the unmarked grounds near Azkaban prison, which Percy can't help but feel is a rather inglorious place for a pureblood wizarding heir to end up. Perhaps that does suggest that there is no Gaunt manor to find, or whatever manor exists is so carefully protected that even the Ministry could not find it. The second was that Albus Dumbledore had put in an appeal for Morphin Gaunt to be exonerated. Percy gapes at the note in the file for several seconds before he can overcome his shock and eagerly scan the rest of the file. Dumbledore had visited Morphin Gaunt early last year and apparently uncovered a memory that suggested that the crime for which Morphin was convicted, murdering the Riddle family, was actually performed by another. Perhaps another family member, unnamed, says the file. Well, Percy knows perfectly well who that family member may be, so what does that mean? Dumbledore knows that Tom Riddle killed his father. Why would Dumbledore be investigating Tom's family, and in such a way that he has publicly recorded evidence to the same? Was he trying to warn Voldemort that he was on to him? Why would Dumbledore wait to investigate the Riddle family deaths until now? Perhaps Dumbledore does suspect that there may be Horcruxes, or perhaps he is merely reading the signs that the Dark Lord may be returning and wants to cover his bases as quickly as he can. April 1995. April brings a blustery sense of chaos to an already unsettled Percy. At the Ministry, owls are blown off course, wards are triggered by gusts of wind, and in some parts of the country, fires seem to be spontaneously erupting. It seems early for Death Eaters. He can't imagine that they would all have prior knowledge of the Dark Lord's return. To tell the Death Eaters early seems risky. Perhaps it is merely an exhalation of energy across the country, one of those times when the natural order of things is disrupted for no discernible reason, something to later be a funny story or remembrance to share with one's peers. Percy spends most of the first and second week of April in an absolute deluge of work, temporarily joining forces with his father's department to handle the obliviation of muggles spotting owls all across the country. Percy, in some sort of sick rehearsal for what may have to come, is cold and unfriendly to Arthur, as if embarrassed to be working with him. He makes sure to comment to Liam in his father's hearing that he's pleased to be working for the Department of International Cooperation instead of misuse of Muggle artifacts. His father's face, more sad than angry, triggers something inside Percy that he only just manages to push away. Liam's face, shocked and uncomfortable, is easier to bear. In the third week of April, Ron, of all people, writes to him about Crouch. Percy had received Hedwig perplexed. He can't remember whether he'd received this letter in the first timeline, and for a wild second before he opens the raggedy scroll he thinks perhaps Harry is reaching out to him for help. But it is only Ron, and the letter is only a few lines. Dear Percy, how is everything at the Ministry? Have you been working with Crouch lately? We hear he is doing poorly. Have you noticed anything odd? Ron P.S. It continues in what Percy would guess is Hermione's handwriting. How is Winky? Percy regards the letter, and Hedwig, facing off with Hermes for access to the water bowl, with some bemusement. Ron had written to him the first time, he vaguely remembers, but he cannot for the life of him recall the particulars of the message. Who had pointed Ron toward Crouch? Dumbledore, Moody, Snape. No, not Snape. Maybe Moody meddling on behalf of Dumbledore. It would be easier if Percy knew anything about Moody's movements at Hogwarts, but aside from Snape's complaints that the man is following him around, Percy is rather clueless. But why would Moody say anything about Crouch to Harry or Ron, and why would they be fishing for information about whether or not he is ill? Perhaps they think that Snape is poisoning him. From what Percy can remember of the teenage trio, they frequently believed Snape was up to something nefarious, and judging from the way that Snape glares angrily at Moody whenever he sees him, he wouldn't blame the trio for jumping to that conclusion. Dear Ron, Crouch does seem ill, or perhaps just under a tremendous amount of pressure. Why do you ask? Percy P.S. No news on Winky. Perhaps you can ask the elves at Hogwarts. They are more likely to know than I the day after. Percy reads a poisonous article by Rita Skeeter about Hermione and winces. Poor girl. He doesn't know what she's done to bother Rita, but whatever it is, Rita is sure to enact her revenge in the most painful way. Orphanage scouting is an excessively displeasing task. Percy feels a surge of pity for all those dirty muggle children, eyes wide and faces gaunt. Even the higher-class orphanages still consign children to rows of beds and communal meals served out of massive trays and jugs. Percy watches one woman dip a long spoon into a big pot of soup repeatedly and shudders. Percy has never been particularly interested in muggles. He doesn't want to kill them, of course, but aside from ensuring the statute of secrecy is upheld, he doesn't find himself thinking of them that often. But it does occur to him that there is something a bit sad, maybe pitiable, about these common problems the muggles face. A few good wizarding tents could solve the overcrowding in these orphanages, even if the users aren't able to cast the wizard space spell themselves. 1 or 2 house elves per institute would substantially increase the overall hygiene of each facility. He visits 5 orphanages in one weekend, and they are all the same. All keep fairly detailed records, and none show any sign of one Tom Riddle. Crouch calls him into his office the following Tuesday. Liam looks up enviously. Crouch's clear and open preference for Percy has destroyed any inkling of camaraderie that may have sprung up between the boys. These reports have been excellent, Crouch says without preamble. I've begun distributing them to the right people. Percy glows despite himself. Thank you, sir. Surreptitiously he reaches out with his magic, but Crouch's feels clean, no apparent signs of the imperious. Percy looks carefully at Crouch's face, but his eyes are clear and his face relaxed. Percy relaxes in turn. This is the kind of thinking that will get us the power we need, Crouch continues, tapping the parchment forcefully. Speak their language. Even half-breeds have a price. Percy blinks at the casual diatribe but doesn't react otherwise. Crouch is a pureblood wizard for all his hatred of the dark arts. I want you to continue on this series. You've made it nearly all the way through the creatures. Centaurs and goblins next. Focus on what we need to buy their loyalty. May I ask why, sir? Crouch smiles cryptically as he regards Percy. You're a practical man, he says finally. I've been watching you, you know. I don't quite know what your ambitions are, but I can see that you are aiming for something. Yes, sir, Percy says, hoping there will be no further discussion of said ambitions. You're not slow, either. You see what's coming, same as me. Percy tries to convey agreement without actually saying anything out loud. Crouch nods, as if Percy's silence confirmed what he was thinking. War's coming, boy, and we're going to win it before it begins. War? Percy asks, surprised. He doesn't think that war is quite obvious yet, though perhaps he hasn't been giving Crouch enough credit. This would have to be proof that Crouch is not being imperiused by someone, right? Surely Lucius or Rookwood or whomever may have incentive to curse Crouch would not want Crouch to know if war was imminent. War, Crouch repeats, between those who would seek to destroy our society with hatred and prejudice, and those who aim to empower it. I can count on you, Weasley. I can sense it. When the time comes to make a choice, you'll choose right. What choice do you think is coming, sir? Percy asks. You'll know it when it comes, mark my words, the older man says, tapping the parchment again. And it's work like this that will set you up for success. I'm proud of what you've done here, Weasley." Crouch had been next in line to be minister, before the public humiliation of his son cast doubt on his suitability for the role. Percy, who very much does not believe the sins of the father should affect the sins of the son, and he supposes vice versa as well, can suddenly see why. Snape writes him a letter, consisting of a single line. "They are in the country, I hear." After the arduous process of breaking Snape's wards, which predictably necessitated Percy scrambling to whip up a small batch of all reveal in his smallest cauldron, the only thing that can fit on his stove, this message is simultaneously over and underwhelming. They are in the country. They, whether shade or man or something in between, the Dark Lord, Tom, is back in the country for the first time in 14 years. Percy casts a glance at the portrait, which is beginning to take shape, and shudders. His wards clang later that evening, echoing with a discordant chord in his head, just as he had found a comfortable place in his bed to hopefully doze off in. Percy jolts awake, sitting upright in his bed, his wand in his hand before he can process that he'd moved for it. Inhaling through his nose in an attempt to calm himself, Percy dives into his own mind, navigating to the part of his mental library where he stores information about the wards, represented as a series of locked cabinets. One of them is vibrating softly and steadily. Licking his dry lips, he reaches out with an unsteady hand and presses his palm against the cabinet door. The ward leaps out at him and envelops him, and Percy has a single, terrible flash of a large, dark house, a manor on the hill enveloped by icy moonlight, and three shadowy figures crouched around a fireplace, before the ward image slides off and deposits itself back in the cabinet, no longer vibrating. Little Hangleton. So the Dark Lord has returned to his father's mansion, with Pettigrew and another companion. Why? Percy cannot imagine any scenario where Tom would want to return to the country and take up residence at his father's house, except that Percy's earlier intuition must have been correct. The Dark Lord is planning to use his father's graveyard as the site on which to return. Despite the late hour, Percy rummages for a quill and parchment, writing out a short letter and encrypting it to the best of his ability with several strong protection spells. Let Snape brew all reveal for 2 words. Not that Percy has copious free time. His free time mostly consists of the late hours of the night, when he cannot sleep. But when Tonks suggests they go investigate some of the disturbances around the country, he agrees. He does not know why Tonks enjoys spending time with him. She's a few years older, at least by appearances, and she is so irrepressibly friendly that he cannot imagine she has any trouble making friends. Each Aura cohort is traditionally clannish. The 1 year of intensive training they suffer through together, generally traumatic enough to bond even the most reticent of individuals. But Tonks, for all her friendliness, does not seem to have very many friends in the ministry. Percy has found her eating lunch alone in Moody's office more than once, and as far as he knows, she's still living at home, rather than in a little flat somewhere with other jocular ministry employees in their 20s. He has very few friends, nearly no friends, and so when Tonks proposes they spend the weekend following up on a lead she has from the Quidditch World Cup, he agrees readily. She apparats them both to a shady park in a small Muggle neighborhood. After he coughs and clears his throat, to convince himself that he is no longer being squeezed through a very small tube, Percy looks around him with interest. He can tell at once the neighborhood is Muggle, though Tonks had not mentioned who they were going to see. It is all very still and flat, as if the small sparks of energy he is accustomed to in his daily life have been meticulously scrubbed out. Nobody obliviated Roberts, Tonks tells him as they make their way from the park to Robert's house. I think everyone expected your Bertha Jorkins to do it. My Bertha Jorkins. Tonks looks up to grin briefly at him. Well, after you mentioned she disappeared, I decided to do some digging. I found that she had been responsible for the Obliviators at the Cup. Bit funny, actually. If you'd not mentioned her, I doubt anyone would have thought to wonder if poor old Roberts was obliviated or not. Nobody was obliviated, in fact, which I will be bringing to the dear ministry's attention after we talk to Roberts. So you mean that all this time he's been? Percy trails off, looking around him, unable to put into words what he is feeling. Tonks nods grimly. He's been here, and I think there's a high chance he remembers what they did to him, the bastards. He didn't say anything to anyone. Would you? Tonks deepens her voice as if to mimic Robert's. Hey, Bob, how was your weekend? Some lunatics tortured me with magic. Still recovering, to be honest. Percy imagines being a muggle, encountering magic, having been tortured by magic, and being unable to tell anyone. He has to concede that Tonks is almost certainly correct. It's here, Tonks says, nodding up ahead at a house that looks very much like the other houses. What's the strategy? Percy asks as they make their way toward the door. Let me do the talking. They're lucky. Roberts himself opens the door, and he doesn't immediately slam it shut, so Tonks is able to smile prettily at him and say, Mr. Roberts, my name is Nancy. I'm from the Ministry of Magic. Roberts goes pale immediately. Now he tries to slam the door, but Tonks is able to wedge her foot in between, and without looking like she's exerting very much effort at all, shoulders the door open. Mr. Roberts, I'm afraid a grievous harm has been done to you, and you've not been able to report it properly, she continues, now standing in his foyer. Percy lingers awkwardly outside, but he can hear Roberts grunt, Go away. I don't want anything to do with the likes of you. Mr. Roberts, Tonks says persistently. I'm a police officer, and I'm trying to find out who did that to you. We need your help. We'll ask you a few questions, and then if you need any medical care, my partner is certified to provide that for you, and then we'll be on our way. Please, Mr. Roberts, we don't want that to happen to anyone else. Percy puzzles over the strange words, but they seem to be convincing to Roberts. After a second, the door swings open fully, and Percy follows Tonks inside. They sit uncomfortably in the parlor. Roberts does not offer them tea. Tonks produces a notebook out of nowhere, a small one with strange lines across the flimsy white sheets, topped with a row of metal rings. The device she uses to write on it is considerably stranger. Percy cannot help but eye it out of the corner of his eye, trying to determine how ink is transferred so smoothly to the page. Sight of the notebook seems, oddly, to calm Roberts, and Percy surmises it's some muggle thing, like an aura badge, that would suggest authenticity, or maybe Roberts is just relieved that Tonks can read and write. Percy isn't sure what the average muggle learns by the time they are adults. Mr. Roberts, we are classifying what occurred at the football tournament an act of domestic terrorism, Tonks says gravely, looking at him in the eyes. My sincerest apologies for the delay in following up with you. What happened exactly? Roberts asks in a low tone, eyes flicking between Tonks and Percy. He shudders, and then elaborates in an even softer voice. What? What did they do to me? Tonks leans forward and says, We call it magic, sir. Roberts barks out an incredulous laugh, but otherwise doesn't object. Perhaps when he'd been revising nightmares of himself and his family, improbably spinning through the air while lights flash below, he'd already considered something like magic. Even muggles must know magic when they see it. It is nothing more than energy, Tonks continues briskly, something like electricity. Some people are able to conduct it more easily through them, people like me and my partner Paul here, and the men who attacked you at the tournament. Others, like yourself, are less sensitive to it. Electricity. Percy gives Tonks an inquisitive glance, which she neatly ignores. As you've experienced yourself this magic, and I use that term loosely, sir, I know how it sounds, can be used to inflict harm as you experienced that night. There is a group of domestic terrorists who we believe are using this ability to harass innocent individuals like yourself. We're doing our best to stop them, but we're having trouble tracking them down. Any information you may have from that night, anything at all, would be exceedingly helpful. Roberts looks at Tonks. His brow is perspiring faintly, and he looks fairly clammy, but otherwise he seems remarkably composed. Percy observes him with some surprise. He thought muggles were a wispy lot, but Roberts has a heft to him that belies expectation. I dunno if I have anything you lot don't already know, Roberts says finally. I think they were all men with their hats and their hoods, like the ruddy KKK. One of them had silver hair. I could see it shining. Percy and Tonks exchange a look. Lucius. One of them was dark-haired and short, Roberts continues, his voice growing mistier as he delves into his memory. Legilimency, says Percy quietly to Tonks. She furrows her brow at him and he shrugs. He can do it. Maybe not expertly, but competently, and it would be more helpful than short and dark-haired. Tonks clears her throat. Mr. Roberts, I hate to ask, but my partner here is capable of using hypnosis to extract a more vivid account of that night. Would you be amenable to us trying? Robert's gaze swings sharply to Percy. Percy does not really know why they are going through this whole fuss. They're going to obliviate the man anyway, so they may as well take what they've come for and then leave without any more conversation. Hypnosis, eh? Robert says in a tone laced with derision. Percy smiles tightly. You won't remember a thing, he promises. Unfortunately, Robert's memory is muddled. Percy has never entered a muggle's mind, but the colors are less sharp, the details more blurry. Perhaps magic aids wizards in keeping their memories sharp, some innate occlumency talent that enriches recollection. He'll have to investigate it later. He falls into Robert's mind and feels the man's panic, his bewilderment, as a man that is undoubtedly Lucius Malfoy points his wand at him. A hint of incredulity, a flash of fear at the wand, and then Robert's perspective flips as he's turned upside down. Pain lacing through his head, his body jerking in response. Cruciatus, perhaps. A loud cackle from a man to the left, half hidden behind the tree. Roberts only seems to notice him because his laugh is so loud and jarring, and Percy tries to focus on the unmasked man, but Lucius twirls his wand, and Roberts careens wildly to the side. The rest of the memory is less informative. Percy watches uncomfortably as Roberts is left on the floor, bruised and frightened, abandoned to make his slow and arduous way home. Muggle transportation leaves quite a lot to be desired, Percy learns, cringing as Roberts hangs on tightly to a metal pole as a train carriage whooshes sickeningly quickly through a dark tunnel. But he fails to learn much else save that Roberts is telling the truth. He knows only of a tall man with blonde hair and a short man with dark hair and a cruel laugh. With a sigh, Percy exits his mind and motions for Tonks to do the obliviate. He tunes her out as she explains to Roberts that she will cause him to forget the trauma and that he has been very helpful and tries to place the laughing dark-haired man. He looked a bit young to be one of Lucius' contemporaries. He'd been unmasked and partially hidden in the trees as well. He looked a bit familiar, if Percy had to guess, but not immediate recognizable. Perhaps the son of one of the Death Eaters, hanging around to get a glimpse, with some distinctive family features, like the Malfoy chin or the Weasley hair that Percy had recognized from a previous classmate. What does not make sense to Percy is why Lucius picked the Quidditch World Cup to inexplicably restart his Death Eater activities after 14 years of silence. Darkening marks aside, why now? June 1995 after that. It's a flurry of preparations. Crouch says he's planning on attending the third task, but he graciously allows Percy to come along too. Percy tries several times to detect dark magic on Crouch, but can find no evidence of it. The auras seem to have concluded that Diggory miscast a spell, and the furor into the investigation of his death dies out quickly, though Tonks mentions to Percy, as an aside, that many of the Light families are outraged at the implication that one of their own would be so careless. Snape does not reply to Percy's last letter, so Percy does not send another, choosing to make his own preparations alone. Percy wards his apartment tightly, hiding all of the sketches of Tom in a locked drawer. The portrait of Arthur leans awkwardly against one wall. He deliberates over what to do with the portrait of Tom, in progress, and then reluctantly decides to hide it in the back of his closet behind his robes and a strong privacy ward linked to his blood. The week prior, Percy had purchased a series of potions and enchanted bandages, which he carefully and methodically packs into a traveling case and then shrinks. To change the size of a magical object without impacting its qualities is quite a feat, and a thrum of his old scholarly satisfaction runs through him at the sight of the miniature case. The day of the third task slips into Percy's mind like smoke twisting above the wick of a candle. He opens his eyes and stares at his ceiling, and his chest feels tight and warm. Despite thinking through it several times, despite consulting with Snape and Myrtle, Percy cannot think of a safe and reasonable way to involve himself in the third task. Despite his desire to take more decisive action, despite his promise to himself that he will be in the forefront of what is to come. No, for this task he will be naught but a voyeur left behind. It burns, but it also relieves. He has thrice now been relieved of responsibility, allowed to hide in the wings while history unfolds. Perhaps he will always have that freedom. Myrtle will be stationed invisibly near the judge's box, able to eavesdrop on the proceedings if necessary. Snape will answer the call if it becomes necessary, though Dumbledore asked him to stay behind. Percy will patrol the maze quietly in his official capacity, though he will not interfere. The first surprise of the day comes when Percy arrives early at Hogwarts and sees his mother, of all people, with Bill waiting in the entrance hall. "Mother," Marley turns. Her smile is a shade tighter than it ought to be, but she moves to embrace Percy nevertheless. "Percy, darling, I didn't expect to see you here." And does that not sting in the small pocket of air below Percy's breast that his own mother does not know enough about his job to expect him to attend the final task? Bill gives him a one-armed hug. "We've come for Harry," he says cheerfully, self-importantly. His relatives refuse to come, though that should be expected. He taps the side of his nose, as if the secret of Harry's abusive relatives is nothing more than a shared joke. Percy immediately sees Dumbledore in this plot. His mother likes Harry, but never would have thought to volunteer herself as his surrogate family for the final task without prompting. And Bill's presence makes little sense, considering he's met Harry a handful of times. Perhaps Dumbledore is expecting trouble of the sort that would require Bill's expertise in wards. After all, the cup is a binding magical contract, and as loath as Percy is to admit it, Bill is likely a better candidate to unravel its mysteries than Percy. Or perhaps there may be some issue with the goblins, as whatever plot Bagman is involved with comes to a head. But why feature the Weasleys so prominently? To push Harry into the firm and loving embrace of his family, of course. That goes without saying. But perhaps Dumbledore wants something else, something more. Something clearly had changed Crouch's mind from the first time he'd allowed the champions' families to visit, and Percy suspects it would take a force like Dumbledore to make that change. "Hiya, Percival," says a voice behind him. Even as he smiles distractedly and greets Tonks under the suddenly cooling stare of his mother, Percy's mind roves over the evidence, trying to find the connection. "I've come to get the truth out of Moody," Tonks reveals conspiratorially as they walk a few steps behind Marley and Bill toward where Harry is sitting, pale, between Ron and Hermione. The truth, Percy, the truth," she says, exasperated. "Where is your mind today?" Percy sweeps a hand at the pandemonium of the Great Hall. Several families have arrived to watch the final task with their offspring, which makes the task's poor visibility all the more egregious, and the loud, multilingual chatter is enough to grate on anyone's ears. "Fair point," Tonks concedes. They arrive at where Harry is being smothered in a hug by Marley, looking both bewildered and pathetically grateful. His eyes are a bit damp, verging on teary, really, and Percy abruptly feels guilty at seeing a plot in every interaction between his family and Harry. The boy is alone, truly alone, and it isn't as if his mother doesn't have the attention to spare. Can it be the boy who lived? Tonks gasps dramatically, laying a hand over her forehead. "Oh, Percival, hold me up." Percy snorts, both at the instantly resigned look on Harry's face and the varying range of bewilderment on everyone else's. At least Harry no longer seems liable to dissolve into tears, which may have been Tonks' intention, now that he thinks about it. "Percival." Ron repeats in a tone of abject derision. Percy rolls his eyes. "Harry, meet Nymphadora, Tonks." Nice to meet you." Tonks winks at him. "Don't worry, I'm not that impressed by you," she says cheerfully. "I expect you've gotten quite enough attention this year without me adding to it. And call me Tonks." "Is she your girlfriend?" Ron continues, staring at Tonks with something like awe. Percy feels his neck grow warm, especially when Marley begins eyeing Tonks with an even icier glare. "No, Ron, we're just friends, and that isn't very polite." He and Tonks leave soon after. By mutual agreement, they walk down to the pitch, or what's left of it anyway. The tall, glossy hedges are dark and menacing even in the light of the morning. A small crowd of workers, with Hagrid towering overhead, haul crate after crate into the maze. Each individual creature had to be specifically granted a permit, and since secrecy was paramount, Crouch had asked Percy to take the lead. The bloody Sphinx was the worst, since she possessed the most independence of all the beings and therefore could negotiate a contract, unlike the giant spiders, which Hagrid merely rounded up and placed in the maze at convenient spots. "What in Merlin's name is that?" says Tonks, laughing, as a giant crab-like creature hisses fire at its handler, causing the woman to drop it with a loud curse. Percy narrows his eyes. "Not on the official forms," he says stiffly, beginning to march down to the maze. Tonks slips her hand in his and tugs him away. Let them be, they're already here, she says chidingly, still smiling. I want to scout the area. I know Moody. He's bound to have set up some wards. Why don't you just talk to him? Percy asks as they begin to stroll along the maze. Luckily, Tonk drops his hand, which removes him of the awkward dilemma of how to extricate his from hers. In all honesty, he's glad for Tonk's presence. The maze is off-putting even to him, and it gives him an excuse to look for any disturbances. The trophy is a portkey. He knows that much. Unfortunately, it is locked inside the headmaster's office and enchanted to appear in the center of the maze precisely when the first champion enters. For all of Percy's suspicion of Dumbledore, he can't imagine him actually sending Harry, untrained and alone, to face the Dark Lord, not to mention run the risk of any other champions finding the trophy first. Percy believes Dumbledore entered Harry into the tournament to capture Tom's interest and bring him back to Britain. The plot to resurrect the Dark Lord must have originated with Tom or Pettigrew, or whoever may be imperiousing Crouch. Percy swallows against a sudden lump of nerves. In some way or another, he's been working towards this night for years, but now that it has arrived, he is all too cognizant of the fact that barely anything has changed. He and Snape decided not to add any protections to Harry, save for a strong tracking charm Snape cast on Harry's trainers. They can do nothing to arouse the suspicions of Tom, for nothing would be worse than his deciding to check on each Horcrux and potentially risk creating more. Harry will be fine. Cedric, well, Percy is resolutely not thinking about Cedric. Perhaps he'll get held up in the maze, and he'll be saved by his own ignorance. That can't be Percy's fault, then. Surely if the Dark Lord really needed an innocent at such a crucial moment, he'd just off one of the Death Eaters, right? Percy. Percy blinks and refocuses on Tonks, whose wand dangles loosely from her hands. She peers closely at him. Everything fine? Yes, he says, his throat dry. He clears it noisily and takes in his surroundings. Sorry, this is a big day. Tonks nods sympathetically. Well, look what I've found. It's a monitoring charm, and it's definitely Moody's magical signature. Can you recognize Moody's magical signature? Percy looks at the shimmery square of the maze that Tonks' detection spell revealed. Tonks snorts. Memorized it during my first week. What, like you don't know Crouches? Don't lie to me. You spend way too many late nights in his office to not pick it up. He does know Crouches, actually, though due to his investigation of the man and not due to proximity to his presence. Detecting and recognizing magical signatures is not as easy as Tonks makes it sound. He has a fairly good idea of his siblings, but again, he has cause to pay closer attention than most. Percy casts the same detection spell as Tonks and is surprised to see several such monitoring spells cast upon this portion of the maze. He leans in and peers into the square and sees why. The magical mirror points to a junction of the maze, and more importantly to the Sphinx sprawled languorously on a small raised platform. Percy snorts again. That platform had been part of her bloody terms. Imagine a Sphinx dictating terms. This one is Crouch's, he says, pulling back, his fingers tracing over one neatly erected square. Crouch's magic tastes to Percy like very old wine. Not fine wine, but rather the type of wine one might make at home and then leave in the cellar, as though hopeful that age will mask its inferior quality. His magic fills the back of Percy's mouth with the heady flavor of fruit slowly fermenting. It always makes Percy feel somewhat nauseated, or maybe dizzy, his tongue searching in his mouth for the source of the taste. Tonks waves that aside. She remains convinced that this entire year of Moody at Hogwarts somehow ties into a challenge that she is failing. Let's keep going, she says, eyes alight with the hunt. Obviously, Moody cast monitoring spells. That's an amateur deduction. Despite their careful investigation of the maze perimeter, they find nothing more save for several monitoring charms and another decidedly illegal fire crab. The rest of the handlers have seemingly refused to help Hagrid with them, and so he alone drags each one into their allotted position in the maze, sweat dripping down his bushy beard. One of the crabs nearly takes off Hagrid's hand. Percy and Tonks both wince in unison as Hagrid roars in pain. Percy does not envy the champions. I really don't know what you expect to find, says Percy as Tonks drags him inside the castle. Moody was hired to look after Hogwarts for the year. What's the big suspense? He transferred me to Scrimgeour. Tonks says disgustedly, navigating quickly the turns to Moody's office. Percy wonders whether the layout of Hogwarts ever leaves the minds of those who spend 7 years in this castle. He certainly could walk through the halls blindfolded by this point, even when accounting for the moving staircases. Scrimgeour, Percy. I think he wasn't expecting to have this position. Moody would never abandon me like that unless it was urgent. So you think this investigation will? What proof that Dumbledore asked Moody last minute? Also, Scrimgeour may not be a bad person to know, Tonks. I hear he's rising through the ranks very quickly. Tonks comes to an abrupt halt outside Moody's office. I want to know what is happening that is so urgent, she says, and her voice is low and serious. Percy can suddenly see the woman she grows into, at least until she dies. And suddenly Percy's mouth is dry, and he nods silently. Suddenly he is thinking of Cedric, and Amos, and even Fred. What is he thinking, letting a 17-year-old boy go blindly into his death? We have to focus on what really matters, he tells himself against the discordant clang in his chest, and steels himself for what must be done. What do you think is happening? Percy says softly as Tonks, throwing a furtive look over his shoulder, begins to dismantle Moody's wards. Lots of dark activity, she says in between spells. I mean, you heard Roberts. Malfoy is definitely in it up till his nose. Someone seems to be rallying the old crowd, spreading rumors that he who must not be named is back, and who other than Malfoy. And you think Moody believes these rumors? Tonks pauses long enough to give Percy a skeptical glare. No, but the threat is credible, at least to some of us. Yes, the threat is not very credible to many others, Percy's past self included. I just don't understand why Malfoy would choose now to bring back the old crowd, as you say, Percy says, shaking his head as if he were absolutely clueless. It seems so. Random. What's likely is that Malfoy wants something, maybe a vote. I think he's angling for something, and he thinks this is the best way to drum up support. Tonks continues, palming a small knife out of her pocket and sliding it along the door frame. She does something Percy barely catches, and the door pops open. Moody never thinks to protect against the Muggle angle. They lower their voices as they step inside the office. Percy has never actually been inside, and he surveys it with interest. The desk has a clutter of magical objects, a faux glass, a curved knife, a telescope. Spiders clatter against jars. There are several trunks stacked in the corner, and 3 ministry-style file cabinets, dented and gleaming and undeniably charmed to Merlin's tree. Percy takes a step forward, looking at the faux glass. It's all nonsense, of course, just a light legilimency spell and the fog for effect. But the fog is clearing, and he feels no prickle in his mind, and a pair of blue eyes rimmed with long, dark eyelashes wink at him mockingly, and he swallows roughly against a dry throat. Percy, Tonks exclaims, pulling him away. She knocks the faux glass over, and he blinks, resurfacing into himself. Don't be an idiot, will you? Everything in here will be cursed. Right, Percy says, shaking his head. He's having such trouble concentrating today, as if his mind is already in that graveyard, with Harry and Cedric and Tom. They try without success to break into the cabinets. Well, Percy tries. Tonks gives it up as a lost cause, and chooses instead to go through the trunks. Something about the way they are leaning casually against the wall makes them feel that the file cabinets are a decoy. In the end, Tonks outwits Moody once again, using a hairpin and her slender silver knife to jimmy open the trunks. Percy makes a mental note to learn whatever Muggle magic Tonks knows, but in the meantime they crowd around eagerly. There are maps, loads of maps, of Hogwarts, of England, of Scotland and Ireland and Wales, even of Germany and France and Portugal. Cryptic markings litter the maps, but neither Percy nor Tonks can make any sense of them. There are notes, too, equally cryptic as the markings, names and dates and places. Some Percy recognizes. One torn parchment lists several old Death Eaters. Others are incomprehensible. Tonks is more trained than Percy, both in aura deduction and in familiarity with Moody's thought process. She shuffles through some papers and then stops, taken aback. My parents are on this, she says softly. Yours too. In another year or two, I reckon your names may be as well, says a gruff voice from the doorway, and both Tonks and Percy whirl, wands out, to see Moody himself surveying them with a raised eyebrow. His eye whizzes around, as if to assess the damage Tonks and Percy did to his things, and then settles intently on his protege. Scrimgeour not keeping you on a tight enough leash. Is he, trainee? Tonks flushes, but maintains her grip on her wand. I want to be involved, she says, gesturing with a tilt of her head to the shelves of parchment littered over the floor. You didn't even bother to set up a detection charm, Moody says instead. Tonks visibly wilts beside Percy. If I were a Death Eater, you'd be dead by now, Missy. Percy has never met Moody, and so watches this interaction intently. Tonks, so brash and bold, looks more like a schoolgirl than Percy has ever seen her. What should you have done? Tonks begins to list off some safety precautions with no small amount of shame. Percy files them away idly in his head, watching how Moody's eye continues to look lazily around. And you, boy, here you're Snape's little lapdog, Moody says with a grunt. Percy bristles. Excuse me. Turned down his apprenticeship, did you? Minerva's too. What's a boy like you doing working for Barty Crouch? That Moody knows exactly who Percy is, that he knows of his apprenticeship offer, though incorrectly informed about Snape, that he's apparently been keeping track of Percy, though Percy has not been keeping track of him. It's unsettling. I'm helping Mr. Crouch run the tournament, Percy says sternly. It's a very prestigious position. Moody smiles darkly at some private joke. And how do you like working for Crouch, eh, son? Percy tries to smile blandly. Mr. Crouch is an excellent superior. Tell Snape that I have my eye on him, Moody says abruptly. Tell him that he's fooling nobody, least of all me. Percy doesn't know what to say, so he says nothing. Tonks gives him a small, worried look, but remains quiet as well. Now off with you, and don't let me see you here again. So Moody is in the order, of course, Percy muses, as he reluctantly leaves Tonks behind with Moody. Percy knew that already. But what surprises him is that it suddenly becomes clear why Moody is at Hogwarts. He must be recruiting for Dumbledore. Doubtless there's a list of ministry employees to be considered. Tonks undoubtedly will be recruited, he realizes with some discomfort. But Moody hardly could be the only plant in the ministry. There's Arthur, for one, and Bode and Bertha Jorkins. Why not bring Moody to Hogwarts to teach defense, assess the students, and see who may be a good recruit? Percy thinks of Draco Malfoy and his mother asking Percy if he is loyal to Dumbledore. McGonagall is certainly in the order. She can handle recruits. Perhaps Moody is there to investigate enemies. The rest of the day passes quickly, too quickly. Percy steps aside from the clamor of his family to check in with Snape, whose face is drawn and harrowed. He is gaining strength, says Snape after closing and locking the door. He settles into his chair and sighs, massaging the bridge of his nose with his long, slender fingers. He is readying for something today, by the evening if I had to guess. Percy frowns. How do you know? Snape pauses, his index finger and thumb still grasping the top of his hooked nose. What? How do you know? Percy repeats. That he is gaining strength today, that he'll make a stand in the evening. The mark, says Snape, as if it should be obvious. He rolls his eyes at Percy's continued confusion and uses his fingers to roughly shove up the sleeves of his robe. Percy has never actually seen Snape's dark mark, or really any dark mark so closely, and he stares at it in fascination. It is ugly, that is Percy's first thought. It is essentially the same design as the Morsemortar spell, a skull with an ugly snake twisting out of it. Interestingly, the tattoo is fairly static, though wizarding tattoos are capable of movements similar to a portrait. The snake curls and hisses, but the skull is still. And as Snape said, it is darkening, actively, the color flooding into the tattoo's outline like blood rushing to a bruise. It seems unlikely that Tom would design such a mark. Percy takes in the crude imagery, the almost phallic image of the snake slithering out of the skull's mouth, the odd juxtaposition of Death Eater, already a questionable name. In his opinion, the Knights of Walpurgis was a far better title, with the image of the skull eating the snake. He feels, oddly, disappointed in Tom. Sometimes Percy used to enjoy the reminders that Tom was 16, nearly half Percy's age, but this particular reminder that Tom was just a teenager when he designed this particular brand bothers Percy for its lack of refinement and foresight. It darkens, Snape says, when Percy still says nothing. It has been darkening all year. You heard me say as much when you spied on my conversation with Karkaroff. So all the Death Eaters will know today that the Dark Lord is returning, Percy says, adding dark marks to his long list of research topics. When Snape had said it was darkening, Percy had thought it would be like a plant growing outside. Impossible to catch in the act. but over time, presenting a clear pattern. But the dark mark seems to be darkening in real time as the Dark Lord comes back to life. So perhaps the dark mark is like the map. It shows the strength of the Dark Lord's soul. We have known that something was imminent, corrects Snape, though I would not put it past some of his more astute followers to guess at the likelihood of his return, particularly today. Percy wonders how else Lucius has been preparing for the Dark Lord's return and whether Narcissa is aware of those preparations. Does it hurt? Can you feel him on the other end? Snape's lips tighten at the questions, but to Percy's surprise he answers. It is a persistent, throbbing pain. It sometimes peaks, perhaps when he performs some kind of magic. Fascinating, Percy breathes. He longs to examine the mark further, but he is cognizant that now is not the time to bother Snape with questions. Instead, Percy clears his throat and raises his head to meet Snape's eyes. We are ready for tonight. We will never be ready for tonight, says Snape with some frustration, but I have secured the diadem, collected our notes and informed the ghost to show them to Albus upon our deaths, and performed the tracking spell on Potter. All we can do now is wait. Percy nods. He holds Snape's gaze for a second longer and then turns to go. Just as quickly, he turns back. Professor Severus, do you think we'll be successful? Snape does him the dignity of responding honestly. I cannot say. But we have no choice but to try. Well, if we do die tonight, then I thank you for being my partner in this, says Percy. He smiles weakly, trying to convey his attempt at levity had been in good faith, however pathetic the delivery may be. It has been a relief to share this burden with you, and an honor to work with you so closely. Snape does not respond, though Percy had not expected him to. Percy had grown up writing thank-you notes to his professors and toadying to his superiors. It was not difficult for him to master the prerequisite embarrassment to such statements. He has no illusions about whether Snape would deign to respond in kind, nor does he imagine that Snape has found it anything close to pleasant to work with Percy, who knows so many of his intimate secrets and has seen several embarrassing episodes. Regardless, Percy could die tonight, or any day over the next year. He does not want to die without thanking the only person alive who knows his secret. When the task begins, he sees a shimmer near the stands as Myrtle takes up her allotted position near Dumbledore and the other judges. Snape stands around the entrance of the maze, conversing in low tones with McGonagall. A long line of redheads make their way to the top of the stands. A flash of silver catches his eye from the Slytherin stands. Draco, sitting next to Narcissa, but without Lucius. In fact, as Percy eyes the Slytherin section more carefully, he notices many of his old classmates sitting with their mothers, but not their fathers. Priscilla Diggory envelops Cedric in a hug, and Molly Weasley does the same to Harry, before the two women walk together into the stands. A lovely French woman kisses Fleur on the cheek and drags her teary husband away. Crumb does not have any family to wish him luck. Karkaroff speaks to him in quiet, gruff tones before giving him what is clearly meant to be a reassuring punch to his upper arm. As the champions take their allotted places near the maze entrance, Percy locks glances with Tonks, who will be patrolling on the opposite side of the maze. She widens her gaze at him, and then winks, her hair turning Gryffindor red, as if to cheer on Harry from afar. He smiles weakly back, grips his wand, and then watches Harry, so small in his Quidditch robes, his glasses jammed untidily on his face. Merlin with you, Percy wishes him. Without thinking, he makes an ancient gesture that Auntie Muriel had taught him, a fist over his heart, wand clasped tightly in his hand. Let the light walk with you, Harry Potter. Then he drops his hand, hoping nobody had seen him, his cheeks burning. He turns away from Harry and Cedric and the rest, steeling himself, and when the cannonball goes off, Percy does not even flinch. The maze is large, and as he walks away from the cheering stands and the loud, jovial brass of the band, he finds the sound slowly slip away, sucked into nothingness by the tall, alien, verdant hedges. The sun seems to fall slowly, and then all at once, and before he can realize that any time has passed, he feels cold. Too cold. Dementor cold. Percy shivers and tries to call for his patroness, but it produces only mist, as usual. Swallowing, he steps closer to the leafy barrier and murmurs a televisor charm. Fleur faces off against a hovering Dementor, her face pale and her knuckles white around her wand. The Dementor flickers through several forms in quick succession, and then collapses onto the ground, a small girl covered in a slowly congealing pool of her own blood. Percy blanches as Fleur lets out a little shriek. Then she seems to steel herself, straightening her back. She bites out a curse that Percy is not familiar with, and the little girl fades quickly into the ground. Percy lets out a sigh as some of the warmth returns to the region. Had Fleur killed the Dementor with a curse? He hadn't known that there was anything to wield against a Dementor except for the Patronus. He's about to cancel the televisor spell when he sees her whip her head behind her. At an invisible sight, she stiffens, her wand arm falling stiffly to her side as her eyes widen with fear. Percy instinctively glances over his shoulder, but he sees nothing but the dark row of green leaves. For a second, he hears something in the soft whisper of the hedges, some mysterious gasp, but then Crouch is behind him, striding confidently out of the mist, and Percy feels marginally better and a bit ashamed of his own jumpiness. "Move along, Weasley," he says gruffly, peering into the televisor square that Percy had created. "Ah, the French girl, how is she doing? She just defeated a Dementor somehow, but I think something just cursed her," Percy says, trying to look around Crouch back into the maze. "Looks like a red cap," says Crouch, his thin frame filling the entire window. "Oh, that'll hurt tomorrow. Well, hopefully the French defense against the dark arts curriculum includes creatures, Now keep going. Moody's only a few paces behind, and you've left the entire front quadrant unpatrolled." With no choice but to obey, Percy casts one more glance toward the maze and then walks on. 3 seconds later, he hears Crouch inhale sharply and then release a shower of red sparks. The sparks throw eerie droplets of blood-like shadows on the ground, but when Percy pauses, feeling rather like he ought to help, Crouch waves him forward. He turns a corner, and Crouch and Moody and all the rest seem to disappear again behind him, and he once again is alone in the mist. He walks on for several minutes before he cannot resist the urge to peek again. The section of the hedge he chose is empty, and he wars with himself for a few seconds before he rattles off 4 quick point-me spells. Fleur is still behind him, though of course the spell is not precise enough for his position to tell if she literally has not moved. Crumb is to his left, up ahead, and both Cedric and Harry seem to be toward the center of the maze. Some instinct drives Percy toward Crumb, and he follows his gently vibrating wand nearly the entire length of the maze before his wand turns inward, suggesting Crumb may be close. He has to peer through the televisor spell only for minutes before he sees Crumb's lumbering frame. Crumb is Imperiused. Percy recognizes instantly, with all his study of the spell. His instincts warn him that something is wrong before his brain recognizes the specific threat, and he finds his wand in his hand and a shield twisting out of it before he can blink. Crumb's eyes are glassy and his movements jerky, and when Percy extends out his magic, the seeking tendrils of his magic bump quickly against the oily film of someone's dark curse. Percy hadn't sensed that earlier, walking by the champions, which suggests to him that Crumb has been recently cursed, which means that the person who cursed Crumb, and perhaps Crouch, is nearby. But it could be anyone. Percy is hardly the only one patrolling the outside of the maze, and someone could have pointed their wand at Crumb and whispered a spell as the boy waited outside for his turn to enter. Percy freezes as Crumb cocks his head and turns to look directly at Percy's televisor spell, as if sensing Percy's presence on the other side of it. He stands impassibly still as Crumb blinks, visibly fighting around the curse, and then subsides in subservience to whoever had cast it. Percy really needs to cast the Imperius more, at least to be able to understand its effects. Does that mean that the caster is in the maze with Crumb, just out of sight, or is he able to fight against Crumb's will from afar? Crumb turns to his right and begins to walk off, his limbs stiff and unwieldy, as if he were a figure poorly animated by a 5th year in remedial charms. Percy watches around the edge of his televisor square as long as he can before he has to cancel the spell and move on. He follows Crumb as best as he can from the outside of the maze via a combination of his point-me charm and the televisor spell. But eventually Crumb takes a turn inward, and the hedge grows back behind him, impervious even to Percy's more powerful spying spells. Percy stands outside and resists the urge to cry out in frustration. He has to think. Why would someone be cursing Crumb? Whoever is out there interfering in the tournament must want Harry to win. Percy had decided that ages ago, and he thinks it is still true. The best way to deliver Harry Potter to Voldemort via the Triwizard Cup is to ensure that Harry is the Triwizard champion, and the meddler must know that it is nearly impossible to create a portkey leading outside the Hogwarts wards unless given express permission from the headmaster, as Bagman and Crouch would have been when enchanting the cup. That leads to an obvious reason for someone to Imperious Crouch, of course. Access to the cup would not be particularly easy to get, and Percy supposes that the best way to ensure Harry wins despite his significantly younger age and reduced magical abilities would be to curse all of his competition. In truth, the other tasks did not matter even the slightest, considering that a head start into the maze would not necessarily confer an advantage. The only contest that truly matters is the third, which also is the most widely attended. Percy had not seen Lucius Malfoy in the crowd, but he easily could be lurking around. Red sparks in the distance. Percy sees them and picks up speed, navigating as best as he can around the edges of the maze until he is close to the fading remnants of the spell. Moody is there, stowing his wand. "Crumb boys, cursed," he says gruffly when he sees Percy. "I'm afraid he went after Potter and Diggory." Barty's up ahead, looking for them. "Cursed? What do you mean, cursed?" "Imperious, I'd reckon," Moody says darkly, casting a suspicious look around him as if a dark wizard would jump out from the hedges. "Why would someone Imperious Victor Crumb?" Percy has to ask doubtfully. Moody gives him a sideways look, his little blue eye spinning violently in its socket. "Dark times ahead, boy," he says, and the tension in his voice travels through the air and down Percy's spine. Times like these, everyone is either a fighter, a sympathizer, an enemy, or a puppet. Will you be, I wonder? A hero, I hope, Percy thinks to himself. Aloud he says, "I'm not much of a fighter, but I'll fight if that's what it takes." Moody looks at him appraisingly. "Let's talk when we're back at the ministry. Now go on. Leave Crumb to me." With a muttered spell, Moody forces the leafy edges of the maze to part themselves, slashing at each vine to create a rent large enough for him to slip through. A second later, he's disappeared, the hedge sealing behind him, and Percy is once again alone. But a few minutes later, he sees Crouch again, somehow in front of him, performing a similar spell to force the maze to let him through. Percy arrives just in time to catch the edge of Crouch's robes as they disappear into the maze. He finds himself following before he can think twice about whether the action is wise. Inside the maze, it is very dark and very quiet. The whispers and sighs that Percy heard echoing intermittently outside are louder here, as if ghosts are floating through each twisted tendril or creatures are rustling in between the leaves. He shivers despite himself, and the sight of Crouch up ahead once again clears some of his anxiety. Crouch looks so reassuringly normal that he makes it difficult for Percy to continue seeing spirits in the shadows. "The Crumb boy's cursed," says Mr. Crouch in an eerie echo of Moody. "I'm going to check on the other two." "And Miss Delacour," Crouch shakes his head. "The red cap got her. Took her out of the maze an hour ago." Percy wonders with the part of his brain reserved for such insane questions how poor the quality of education must be at Beauxbatons if a seventh-year student can't defeat a red cap. Crouch follows a series of invisible instructions through the maze, taking its turns with confidence. Likely, as one of its architects, he had the requisite knowledge to decipher the cipher of its construction. But to Percy, following close behind, it is impossible even to tell what direction they are facing, let alone what next to do. But eventually Crouch stops, so suddenly that Percy smacks right into his back. The apology dies in Percy's throat when he looks over Crouch's shoulder and sees the tableau, unexpected and arresting. Harry and Cedric are both looking at the goblet, its silver light casting strange shadows on both of their young faces. Crouch must cast an amplification spell, for a second later Percy can hear their voices clearly, as if they were standing next to him and not several meters away. "Take it," Harry is insisting. "I don't want it, Cedric. I've just been trying not to die." "You were here first," Cedric replies. His voice is raw and full of an emotion Percy cannot identify. Harry hesitates and then says, "But your father, Cedric. I saw he, passed away. He want you to win." "My father raised me to do the right thing, and I'd be finished if you hadn't doubled back," Cedric snaps back. In front of Percy, Crouch shifts uncomfortably. Percy is feeling rather awkward himself. You've been ahead of me this whole time, Harry insists. Percy can see how he gestures to the maze as if to encompass the entire mess the tournament has been. I've barely survived this far. You haven't struggled with any of the challenges. Come on, Cedric. A pause, then with humor. I get enough attention as it is. For a second, Percy thinks that Cedric is going to take Harry up on his offer, and panic thuds heavily in Percy's stomach. Harry has to go. Harry has to go. Together, then, Cedric suggests, and reaches for the goblet. The spell twists out of Percy's wand before he can think through its ramifications, a bolt of red that flies over Crouch's shoulder and lands squarely in Cedric's back. Harry jolts back in surprise, but his hand has already touched the handle of the goblet, and he's wrenched away before he can take a step towards Cedric's crumpled body. Then it is very silent. "Mr. Weasley," says Crouch, his voice as cold as the mist gathering beneath their robes. "What in Merlin's name did you do?" "I'm sorry," Percy gasps, feeling the heat of his embarrassment burn wetly down his back. Harry was here first. He should win. There's only one Triwizard champion." Crouch continues staring ahead at Cedric's body, while Percy entertains a full-fledged panic attack behind the other man's back. Well, if he loses his job, he supposes he can go and join the Order without anything to stop him save his distaste of Dumbledore. But Percy couldn't do it. He couldn't let Cedric go, not when he sees now how it happened. Harry had all but talked Cedric into his death, led him to Voldemort for no reason at all. The enemy, Karkaroff, or Moody, or whoever it may be skulking around, took out each enemy in turn, but had not counted on Harry Potter's bloody need to have moral fiber at every opportunity. Even Harry had said it. He wouldn't have made it even halfway through the tasks on his own. Then Crouch begins to laugh, a creaky, odd sound, as if unused to the gesture. "I misjudged you, Weasley," he says. "You've got your head on straight, even if you have me worried at times. Come, let's bring the boy back to the front, and neither of us shall say anything. Is that understood? Harry Potter is the Triwizard champion." Hardly able to believe his luck, Percy nods hastily. His mind turns to Harry, facing the Dark Lord, and any relief he may still be entertaining is replaced by panic. Percy may have stupidly, impulsively saved Cedric, but may have damned Harry and the rest of the wizarding world beside. The hour or so in between Harry disappearing with the cup and reappearing at the front of the maze, covered in blood and sweat and tears, shouting about the Dark Lord having returned, is one of the worst 78 minutes of Percy's life, in either life. He stands at the front of the crowd, meters away from the blaring band, and watches as the net of tension ensnaring the other judges tightens and flexes its hold. The audience, of course, does not know that Harry has already won the cup, and Cedric, groggily being treated for his injuries alongside Victor and Fleur, does not seem inclined to tell anyone. Perhaps he believes that Harry was the one who stunned him, or perhaps he saw Percy somehow, or perhaps he remembers nothing. But Crouch leaves Percy after they deposit Cedric back at the healer's tent and climbs the stairs quickly to where Dumbledore sits with the other headmasters. Percy debates with the idea of trying to join them, but he cannot stomach the thought of hearing them speculate where Harry may be, and he does not want to remind Crouch of his complicity in the proceedings. He tries to think of Crouch, to plot what he'll say to the other man when he inevitably confronts him outside of the emotionally charged environment of the third task, but he can think only of Harry, tiny, stubborn, idiotic Harry, and Tom's sly, icy power. Harry doesn't stand a chance against Tom, against any version of Tom, and Percy was an idiot to let him go to the graveyard unattended. Timeline be damned. But the Dark Lord must return, and this is the only way they know to ensure he does so. But once he returns, they can finally take action. Nodding distractedly at Tonks, pacing back and forth with Moody, Percy turns his thoughts to Harry, 14 years old and about to face the Dark Lord. Again. Percy doesn't know precisely what occurs in the graveyard, nor does he know how Harry survives, but somehow that small boy at the breakfast table faces Tom again and again and comes away unscathed. Percy has at times wished he were the child of destiny, marked for greatness at an early age. Sometimes he churlishly thinks to himself that Harry need not excel at his classes, nor make many friends, nor secure a good job. He merely has to play out the challenges set for him, answer the intertwined calls from his headmaster and his sworn enemy, fulfill a prophecy. It feels like all Harry must do to be great is to pass a series of tests, and Percy certainly knows how to pass tests. This behind-the-scenes type of action, all waiting and planning and hoping with a tight chest for the dominoes to fall as they should, is far less exciting or glamorous or even fulfilling as Percy once thought it may be. Of course he is here for a reason. Years have blunted but not removed the forcible impact of Fred dying, laughing at a joke Percy made. But now that he is here, he feels very much invisible and very much blind, and that rankles him even as it frightens him. Although, Percy muses, turning his gaze away when he accidentally finds himself watching Cedric, now reunited with Cho, he's perhaps less good at passing tests than he'd thought. Perhaps all he is good for is waiting on the outskirts of the drama, not accepted anywhere, hoping desperately he is not creating more of a mess than he is cleaning. After all, this entire evening has been an unmitigated disaster, and it's largely his own bloody fault. And then Harry appears, and he is screaming, and his arm is ripped open and scarred with blood, and a shock travels tangibly through the crowd and sparks at Percy's fingers. Before, Percy had been in the box with the other judges, high above the drama. Now he is very much close enough to hear Harry immediately begin to shout that it was him, that he is back. He is close enough to see the blood ooze from Harry's arm, to feel the oily slick of dark magic hovering over Harry like a noxious cloud, to feel in his body the discordant clashing of sounds as the band abruptly falls silent. It happens very quickly after that. The judges appear as if by magic, but not quickly enough to quell Harry's cries from echoing across the suddenly quiet arena. Moody is there to grab Harry as he stumbles, Tonks right behind, conjuring a blanket and wrapping it around Harry's trembling, thin shoulders. Crouch arrives first, then Dumbledore, then McGonagall and Snape, and the other two headmasters shortly after. Shouting, lots of shouting, and for a prolonged second Percy cannot breathe in the tangle of sounds. The group begins to walk back to the castle, though Tonks peels off at a barked command from Moody to try and contain the surging crowd behind. Percy tries to follow, stepping quickly around the other champions before Tonks erects a ward to keep the rest out. But McGonagall gives him such a terrifying glare that he halts, and then he shakes his head and continues on. He is Crouch's under-secretary. He will not be left out of what is to come. He has more of a right to this drama than anyone knows. By the time he reaches Dumbledore's office, a conversation clearly has begun. The gargoyle lets him up after a prolonged stare, and all of the occupants of the office turn and look at him together when he bangs in awkwardly. He opens his mouth to explain, but Crouch motions him over in a short, aborted gesture, and he shuts his mouth and hurries to his side. Harry is pale, holding his arm. Blood drips silently to the ground. "Mr. Weasley," Dumbledore says neutrally. "Harry was just about to tell us what happened." Harry's eyes dart around all of the adults. They linger on Dumbledore with a complicated expression that Percy cannot name, rest briefly on McGonagall, and then swing to Percy. For some reason, Harry holds his gaze, perhaps because Percy is the only person in the room even close to Harry's age, or perhaps because Harry still thinks of Percy as his best friend's swotty but well-meaning older brother. Percy nods, gently, and Harry takes a deep breath. Dumbledore notices, so does Snape, and McGonagall and Crouch and Moody. Perhaps the only one who doesn't notice is Harry himself. "It was a portkey," he says, his voice hoarse. "The cup. Cedric and I reached it at the same time. I think someone attacked Cedric, I dunno. We were going to touch it together, and then Cedric just fell. It took me to a graveyard, I think. There was a voice. 'Subdue the boy,' it said." Percy shivers involuntarily. He can picture that voice all too well. "Pettigrew was there. He captured me, tied me to a gravestone. There was a cauldron, some potion bubbling in it, I dunno." Harry looks at Snape and then gives a little shrug of his shoulders. "I couldn't see anything. Was there steam?" Snape says as once. "What color was the brew? What kind of cauldron? Was Pettigrew actively stirring it, and in which direction?" "I dunno, all right," Harry exclaims, some of the flush returning to his face. "I was tied to a gravestone. Severus," says Albus sternly. Let Harry finish. There shall be time for more questioning later. Harry does not look particularly thrilled by the thought of more questioning, but he continues his story. "The voice, it said that it needed my blood. Something about the bone of the father, the blood of the enemy willingly given." Harry's voice takes on a cadence as he repeats the potion's instructions, and Snape hisses to himself, just once. Percy does not look his way. How would it feel to know the Dark Lord so well to be able to predict which awful ritual he will use to force himself back to life? Pettigrew, he took my blood. For a second, all eyes swing to Harry's bleeding arm, which for some reason has yet to be healed. Then out of the cauldron rose, well, Voldemort, I guess. Crouch gives a start at the name. His skin is pale and clammy, but his eyes are bright and intent. Fully formed? Moody asks eagerly, taking a step forward. Yes, but he didn't look like a man, Harry says, his vision clearly inward. He was something else, something not human. His skin was smooth, and his nose was like a snake. Snape doesn't do anything as amateurish as meet Percy's gaze, but Percy senses all the same how the other man registers Harry's words. Despite the memories Percy provided, he has felt that Snape doesn't fully trust his story. Hopefully now those doubts will be forever extinguished. Snake, mutters Moody, almost approvingly. It makes sense that is the form he would choose. It's a dark sign. Yes, says Crouch acidly in reply. As one would expect from a Dark Lord, wouldn't you say? In the last timeline, Crouch had been killed before the Dark Lord returned. Percy had never considered how the man would take the news of Tom's return. Unlike many at the Ministry, Crouch seems perfectly ready, even eager, to accept the fact that his most hated enemy had resurrected himself. Then he wanted us to duel, Harry continues. He made me bow. Something changes in Dumbledore's expression, but Percy doesn't know the other man nearly enough to take a guess at what. Percy watches Dumbledore carefully as Harry recounts how he evaded the first few maneuvers, but then had to face Tom. I decided that if I was going to die, I'd do it like my parents, Harry says fiercely, and then flushes. Oh, Harry, says McGonagall tearfully, speaking up for the first time. You are very much like your parents. Dumbledore inclines his head, and Percy isn't sure, but he thinks he sees something like satisfaction glint in his eyes. Very admirable, my dear boy, especially for one so young, he says softly. Not many would have the courage to face their death head-on. Well, then our wands, connected, I'd say, and ghosts began to stream out of Voldemort's wand. Those he'd last killed, I think. There's a rustle from all parties at that, but nobody speaks, and after a second Harry continues. My parents, they told me to run. I wrenched my wand away and I sprinted toward the cup. I summoned it and then I arrived back here. Fought the Dark Lord and won, did you? Moody says gruffly. There's many an Auror who can't say that. Well done, boy. Harry flushes some, this time presumably in pride. McGonagall nods and moves across the room, resting a hand on Harry's shoulder. You have done Gryffindor proud tonight, she says, and for the most fleeting of seconds Percy feels a shade of his earlier jealousy burn in his stomach before can return to his senses. I will go to the hospital wing and inform Madame Pomfrey what to expect. Crouch nods too, looking already 10 years younger. Cornelius will be here soon, he says and shares a glance with Dumbledore. There will be trouble. Between you and me, Barty, I think we can keep him cowed, Moody says with a gruff laugh. Percy had never thought of Crouch and Moody being friends, per se, but he supposes this is an issue on which they align very neatly. Percy still isn't sure what he has changed to keep Crouch alive this long, but perhaps the Ministry will be more prepared this time, and Percy will get to play a part in it. Perhaps he won't even need to distance himself from his family, not if Crouch believes the Dark Lord has returned. If you would, Alastair and Bartholomew, head him off if he is on his way to this office, Dumbledore says pleasantly but firmly. Harry needs to rest. Percy lingers in the hopes he'll be asked to stay, but Dumbledore merely smiles and says, Mr. Weasley, I trust you remember the way to the hospital wing. Snape does not need an invitation to stay. He waits impatiently for Harry and Percy to collect themselves and leave, and Percy would bet anything he would explode with questions the minute they were out of the room. But the door swings behind them, and Percy and Harry are left alone. Percy waits until they are clear of Dumbledore's office before he bursts out. What was he like? Harry looks up, blinking owlishly. Terrible, he says, and his voice is once again weighty. Terrible but great, I think he was once called. His magic, he trails off, shivering. What? Percy asks impatiently when it is clear Harry will not continue. Harry shrugs one shoulder. It was like an electric shock when it touched mine, he says. And the Cruciatus. Percy subsides guiltily at that, and they walk for a few more minutes in silence. Who told you that? Percy asks when he cannot bear to keep quiet any longer. Terrible, but great. Ollivander, actually, Harry says absently. He gives a short, bitter laugh. Did you know that our wands share a core? Percy nearly stops in shock, but forces himself to keep walking. Really? Something like that, anyway. He said that when I got my wand. Harry trails off again, but this time because they've nearly reached the hospital wing, and it is very clearly packed. Once again his eyes flick to Percy, and while Percy would not say that Harry was one to seek reassurance from anyone, at the same time he feels as though Harry is checking for something that Percy cannot name. Before Percy can think on it, Harry squares his shoulders and walks inside. Marley rushes to him at once, and Ron, and Hermione, and even Bill. Tonks isn't there, likely with Moody and Crouch, which is perhaps where Percy ought to be too. There's a large black dog, actually, and Percy narrows his eyes at it. Well, Sirius Black, back from hiding. The dog is, if possible, skinnier than when Percy saw it last. How an heir of a most ancient and noble house seems to be completely incapable of feeding himself is beyond Percy. At the very least, he should be able to acquire an extra wand and a wizarding tent. Percy doesn't personally have experience with the type of disreputable places that would sell a wizard an unmatched wand, but he knows perfectly well they exist, and imagines a Black would have several of them in mind for exactly this type of situation. Nobody pays Percy any mind. Madame Pomfrey competes with Marley for control of Harry's health, as if there ought to be a competition between a trained Mediwitch and a housewife. A similar struggle appears to be erupting between Ron and Hermione over the privilege to stand at Harry's unoccupied side. Ron wins, and Hermione glares at him balefully. Percy is just contemplating slipping out when Fudge, irritable, and with the dreadful green bowler hat he sports throughout the decline of his career, strides in with purpose. "Minister," Percy says loudly in an attempt to cut through the clamour. Fudge looks at him distractedly. "Ah, Weasley. Crouch sent you to monitor the champion." Very good, you may go now." Fudge appears entirely blind to the host of other Weasleys in the room, or at least blinded to the possibility that Percy may be in the room for reasons other than his job. Well, that blindness is what cost Fudge his career. "Minister," Marley starts. Black, Percy notices, slinks under the bed. Fudge holds up a hand. "Please, ma'am, if any of what you were going to say contains the words you know who, I don't want to know," he says, clearly harried. He mutters something to himself which sounds vaguely to Percy as if, had enough already. Percy conceals a grin. He must have met Crouch and Moody at the doors. "My job here is not to conduct an investigation, but rather to close the tournament. Potter, your winnings." He thrusts a bag of galleons at Harry, who takes it awkwardly. Ron, beside, takes a very deep breath at the sagging bag, and even Marley's eyes track it as Harry places it with a clunk on the bedside. "But Minister, Harry said that Victor was imperiused and Fleur attacked, and Harry badly injured," pipes up Hermione, who Percy could not help but notice, brushes aside the issue of the gold as if it were the small fly buzzing around the room. "Surely an investigation will be done." "Yes, of course, but it shan't happen tonight," snaps Fudge. "Do you know how much there is to do? We've to oversee international portkeys for all of the parents and students departing. Weasley, on second thought, you'll return with me to the office and make sure all those infernal creatures get packed away and take the goblet back to the archives and a host of other things besides. Students have been harmed in the tournament before, and I dare say they shall do so again, but that was the risk they all accepted when they put their names in the goblet. Potter, I imagine you'll be healed by morning." "It was Voldemort," insists Harry, his green eyes dark and steady. "We didn't sign up to face off with Voldemort." Fudge combines a flinch and an eye roll into a single confused gesture. "I won't hear any more about you-know-who tonight, is that clear?" Percy clears his throat and steps forward. "If you wish to make an official statement, you may contact the Aura Department," he says, catching Harry's eye in an attempt to ignore Ron's look of outrage. Harry looks back mulishly, but Hermione puts her hand on his arm, looking thoughtful. Thank Merlin, at least one of the trio has brains. Although, perhaps Harry shouldn't make a statement. After all, they don't want the Ministry to take the threat too seriously, just a bit more seriously than they had before. Moody is in the Aura Department, though. Last time he hadn't done too much, which is rather surprising now that Percy thinks on it, but perhaps in this timeline he'll get the auras a tad more prepared. Percy has no choice but to follow Fudge back to the office after he exchanges a few more curt words with Harry. Nobody bids him goodbye. As soon as he leaves, he sees them move to close ranks around Harry again. Loyal, the lot of them, though not to him. He's an orphan, Percy reminds himself, forcing his thoughts away from his resentment with a lurch. Tom had been an orphan and managed to survive to adulthood without stealing an entire wizarding family. But then again, Harry was no Tom. He's an orphan and he's alone, and he's telling the truth. He needs their support more than I do. The ministry is in a bit of turmoil, which is to be expected, both with the conclusion of the tournament and Harry's wild claims. Crouch isn't in his office, though Liam is in the adjourning room, and they share a grim look before turning to the mountain of paperwork that needs to be completed to authorize the transportation and authorization of various employees, wizards, and animals. Percy staggers home sometime the following evening, feeling his head pound with every beat of his heart. He collapses on the couch, his father's painted gaze following him as he presses his fingers to his temples. Some people had mentioned the Dark Lord, but not many. Liam had started to say something about Harry Potter, taken one look at Percy's face, and then trailed awkwardly into silence. Even Harry's story of the Dark Lord was hardly spoken about. Likely most of the ministry wasn't yet aware. There had been nothing in this morning's prophet, a conspicuous silence from Rita Skeeter, who definitely is using the time to cook up something nasty. There's nothing from Snape either. Perhaps he's gone to the Dark Lord. Percy pictures him kneeling at the feet of the Dark Lord, reborn, and shudders. He wonders what Tom's followers felt about his new appearance. To go from a handsome and charismatic young man to a half-reptilian beast was quite the disappointing evolution. He cannot help but ask himself if Tom had meant to return in that form, or if the potion that Harry observed had gone wrong. Given that Pettigrew was likely the brewer, the latter seems likely. The Dark Lord has returned, he thinks to himself as he struggles off the couch and into his bathroom. He wonders what Tom is doing on his first day back. To Percy's surprise, Crouch says nothing about Percy's actions at the third task, but he begins to look much improved, spending far more of his time at the ministry, though he continues to disappear mysteriously for long stretches at a time when Percy knows he does not have meetings. His inbox remains overflowing as well, though Percy feels emboldened enough to take care of clearing it after Crouch catches him in the act, but does not castigate him for the presumption. As a result, Percy receives a first-hand glimpse into how the rest of the world is taking the alleged news that Voldemort has returned. France seems to be the most insistent that Harry is telling the truth. Perhaps Fleur trusts Harry, or Madame Maxine has heard something through her giant connections. Many of the other department heads that contact Crouch are merely seeking clarification, an explanation of why the boy who lived may be making such claims, and whether or not they ought to be worried. To these, Percy neutrally relays the chain of events, that Harry won the tournament, but claimed he saw Voldemort resurrect himself. He neither endorses nor denies the claims, writing the replies in the form of a formal stock letter. Let the countries do with that information what they wish. Percy will not be responsible for any calls to battle or unwise laxity. Moody, on the other hand, calls Percy in as promised. He spends most of the time grilling Percy about Karkaroff and Snape, trying to assess if Percy believes them to be dark wizards. To this also, Percy tries to remain neutral. He merely states that he has not seen any evidence to suggest either are aligned with the Dark Lord, but given they can't be certain what Dark Lord has even returned, Percy does not feel comfortable speculating. "Keep your eyes open, boy," says Moody at last, the attention of his blue eye disconcerting to Percy. "I trust Aura, Tonks, and she speaks highly of you. I expect you to come to us if you learn anything we ought to know." Despite racking his brains, Percy cannot really recall what role Alastair Moody took in the first timeline. He dies at some point in the final year of the conflict. Presumably, he is in the Order, though he leaves the ministry soon after Scrimgeour is removed. But perhaps Percy could work with Moody if he sticks around. Despite the fact that he really ought to be feeling the opposite, Percy can't help but feel a bubbling of pride and anticipation, and dare he say it, hope every time he thinks about the future. He is no longer shackled. He saved a life, and it looks like it didn't negatively impact the timeline nor cause him to be fired. Perhaps something he did saved Crouch, too. Between he and Crouch and Tonks and Moody, maybe the Ministry will have a fighting chance now. In his apartment, the portrait of Tom is coming along nicely, his hand moving over the canvas as if guided by a spell. The late spring had shaped up to be gorgeous, and the summer seems to be continuing the trend, as if to mark Percy for his fear of the darkness, undoubtedly curling its way across the country. Percy lingers in the sun on his walk home, choosing to take the furthest possible apparition point, if only to have a few extra minutes of sun before he returns to his flat. He's struggling with the charm to enchant windows inside. He blames his landlord, who seems to have put up a ward on the walls to prevent his tenants from magicking themselves a better view. And his desk inside the Ministry is in a crowded inner bullpen. So sometimes these walks home are the only times he can look around him and see nature. After nearly a decade and a half of living at Hogwarts and the Burrow, Percy is finding it surprisingly difficult to adjust to his city life. Cedric Diggory accosts him on one of these walks in June, when Percy, dropping his guard, stops to linger in a particularly warm patch of sun, admiring the large English oak tree that borders a tiny Muggle dog park. For a second, he's mesmerized by the way the light dances emerald green through the canopy of leaves, and then his neck prickles, and he whirls around with his wand out to find Hogwarts' most recent graduate, looking rather shifty. And Cedric, Percy says, dropping his wand but not stowing it. You scared me. Cedric raises his hands apologetically. Cedric and Percy are only a few years apart in age, and while Cedric was always closer to Fred and George on the odd times the Diggory and Weasley families would get together in Ottery St. Catchpole, he and Percy always had a perfectly cordial relationship. Sorry, Cedric excuses himself with a wan grin. It's just, I need to talk to you, Percy, in private. Percy flicks his gaze around, but there are only a few muggles about, eyeing Percy's wand curiously. Percy flushes and finally flicks his wand back into his holster, which disappears from sight. What's it about? Cedric looks around him too, but more obviously and with more desperation. Mr. Crouch, he whispers, the sound like the susurration of the emerald leaves above. Percy debates for a second the wisdom of taking Cedric to his flat, but he does not particularly like the idea that anyone know where he lives, and so instead he walks with Cedric until they are firmly ensconced in the center of the park, dogs yapping loudly on either side, and a strong privacy ward erected. What about Mr. Crouch? Cedric hesitates and then says, leaning in, he cursed me, Percy. At the tournament, I saw him. Oh, Merlin. Oh, bloody Merlin. Percy swallows and then replies in what he hopes is a neutral tone. What do you mean? I was there, insists Cedric. He gazes over Percy's shoulder, and though Percy feels the urge to glance behind him as well, there are only two Muggle women and their large brown dogs. There was a spider. Well, the whole maze was horrid, but there was a spider at the very end, one of Hagrid's giant spiders, and Harry saved me from it. We were going to take the cup together, you see. Together. Percy asks stupidly, trying to buy himself some time. Yes, Cedric says defensively. We're both from Hogwarts, and it wasn't like the other champions were anywhere to be found, and my father, well, Harry was the one who suggested it. And then you say that Mr. Crouch cursed you. Cedric twitches at the obvious surprise and skepticism in Percy's question. I know how it sounds, but yes. I saw him clearly, like those women over there. He stunned me so that Harry would win. And then Harry went off to battle you know who. Merlin, Percy. What if Crouch knew? I mean, Victor and Fleur, they're no slouches at magic. We all saw Fleur take down that dragon, and Victor at the lake they could easily have made it first to the cup. What if Crouch was wading around, ensuring that Harry was the one to get portkeyed out? Percy supposes, for a wild, frenetic second, that if the plot were so obvious that even Cedric Diggory could easily deduce it, whoever was around meddling behind the scenes must not be particularly clever. Then he tries to focus back on Cedric. Damage control. He can't have Cedric repeating his suspicions about Crouch to all and sundry. Crouch is a victim in this, and Percy is certain he isn't being imperiused at the moment, and Percy won't have him taken out of a spot where he could be useful just because Percy had felt a moment of sentimentality in the maze. Equally so, Percy cannot admit to his own error. But where to point Cedric? I know it sounds absurd, Cedric says into the silence. I mean, my own father worked closely with Crouch, and he thought very highly of him. But someone murdered my dad, and what if it was Crouch? Percy opens his mouth without any plan. What comes out of it surprises both of them. I think there is a Death Eater in the Ministry, working behind the scenes. What? Think about it, Percy continues, mentally swearing at himself, but with no choice other than an obliviate to continue on this course of action. It's not Crouch. I've seen him every day for months. There's not a chance he'd be able to hide the fact that he was a Death Eater from me. But someone had to have access to the cup, and it was more likely than not a Ministry employee. Polyjuice, Cedric suggests, his brown eyes wide. Perhaps, Percy says thoughtfully. Certainly Polyjuice would be difficult to detect. Unlike the Imperius, it is not technically dark magic, though it is classified as a dark potion. Polyjuice is nothing more than bottled self-transfiguration, powered by the transformative substance of a person's hair or fingernails. What should we do? I am investigating, and quietly, so don't go around telling people, says Percy. Merlin, Cedric, if someone targeted Mr. Crouch, I'll be in danger if anyone thinks I know more than I ought. Promise me you shouldn't say anything to anyone. Cedric nods solemnly. What shall I do? When Percy pauses, Cedric narrows his eyes. Percy, I won't sit by quietly. There's dark times ahead, we can all see that. I was the Hogwarts champion. That means something. Go talk to Dumbledore, then, suggests Percy, ignoring with some practice the flare of jealousy that ignites in his stomach when he hears Cedric lay claim to the title of Hogwarts champion. What would it feel like to know that you and you alone were chosen to represent the entire school? Rather like being chosen for head boy, Percy supposes, but better. But Cedric, please don't mention my name. You don't trust Dumbledore? Cedric asks astutely. Percy shakes his head. No, it's not that. But I work so closely with the minister, and others they'll turn on me if they hear me taking Dumbledore's side. I'd rather talk to Dumbledore myself, rather than have you do it. Cedric nods. Percy has always thought of him as a reasonable sort of chap, and he proves that assumption right again. It probably follows some Hufflepuff rulebook for Cedric to keep mum on Percy's involvement, given it would be unthinkable for Cedric to assume Percy is not going to forthrightly go to Dumbledore and confess his suspicions at the earliest possible opportunity. Cedric is not a particularly subtle boy, but Percy thinks he could rely on him to keep his word. Thanks, Percy. I knew I could count on you. We artery lads have to stick together, don't we? Percy smiles weakly and watches as Cedric lopes away, stopping to pet one of the dogs on his way out, exchanging a smile with the Muggle women. Then he makes his own way to the apparition point, though the warmth of the sun no longer is as pleasing. Despite the clamor of the tournament, Harry does not make a statement to the auras, whether out of laziness or reluctance or some other cunning. The Aura office does not start any sort of serious investigation into anything, reports Tonks, despite Moody's rather dramatic re-entrance into their ranks. Perhaps Dumbledore has come to the same conclusion as he and Snape, that it would be better if Tom did not feel too threatened by the Ministry. Percy makes great strides on the portrait. It is easier this time, somehow, as if something were controlling his hand. He finds he can easily picture Tom's features in his head, and his brushes move smoothly and adeptly over the canvas, as if he were a much more talented painter. Percy is summoned home to the Burrow 2 weeks after Ron returns from school. His youngest brother is moody and quiet, but Fred and George are the complete opposite, gleefully locking themselves into their room to create explosions. Even Ginny is uncharacteristically quiet throughout supper. Nobody really notices, since Ron, in the midst of a protracted sulk, seems intent on picking a fight with Percy, daring him to commit to either denouncing or supporting Harry. Stop it, Percy snaps after Ron's third snarky comment. I told this to Ginny, and I'll tell it to you. We don't know what Harry saw or what it means. Just because a figure emerged from a cauldron and claimed to be the Dark Lord doesn't mean it's true. And even if it is, we don't know what magic he used to reincarnate himself. We don't know what he remembers or what he's capable of doing. You just don't want to believe Harry, Ron snaps right back. Why would he lie? I don't think he's lying, but he may not know what he saw, Percy says heatedly. He's 14, and if he's anything like you, he's not much of a scholar. It wouldn't take much to convince him of something that's not true. Do you mean our Ronald is not a scholar? Fred inserts entirely unhelpfully. Nor young Harry either. George is right on his heels. Why, Ronald, we thought you were as much of a swat as dear perfect Prefect Percy here. Percy turns on them in a fury and Arthur speaks up, his voice final. Enough, boys. They subside, though Fred and George continue grinning. Percy's right, Ron. No, he is. We don't know what Harry saw, and we don't know what it means, but Albus believes whatever came back that night poses a threat to us and to Harry. We're going to be leaving the burrow. What? We'll be going to a safe house, says Arthur, exchanging a look over Percy's head with Marley. You'll know more when we arrive. We leave in 1 week. Is Harry coming? Ron immediately asks. Am I? Percy wonders. He'd not been invited the last time. This had been well after his screaming match with his father. Should he go with them, try and wrangle an invite to the order? The obvious answer would be yes, but perhaps he ought to stage that screaming match and try to learn more about what Tom is up to. Without the tournament, Percy won't have an excuse to go to Hogwarts, and he shan't be able to talk to Snape so frequently. He's liable to spend the whole of next year sitting behind his desk, processing paperwork for Crouch. They'll probably ask him to join the order tonight, which will definitely make it complicated to later break from the family. But equally so, if he does cause a scene, will they invite him back in if he later regrets it? That seems more probable. Last time Marley had begged him repeatedly to reconsider his hateful words to his father. Harry will come, at some point, Arthur says delicately. Percy wonders when he discussed this with Dumbledore. Albus needs him to spend time with the Dursleys. Something about the wards, I believe. The wards. What kind of wards would require Harry to stay with his Muggle relatives for a certain amount of time? They could not be magic-based wands, given that the Dursleys are Muggle. The only thing that Percy can think of that would be nourished by physical presence is a blood ward, which would be decidedly dark. Hadn't there been something that Dumbledore had said, a few years ago, about how Lily had protected Harry? And since Harry, after the war, was so insistent that his mother was the reason that he survived the killing curse, means that those blood wards may be based on sacrifice, which is decidedly more powerful. He'll be a stuffed Kneazle at the Dursleys. Marley breaks in. He'll be protected, Ron. But you cannot say anything to him, do you understand? Arthur looks at Ron steadily, and then at the rest of the family. None of you can say anything about Harry, about this safe house, about anything else you may learn to anyone. You may speak to Harry when he arrives, but say nothing in a letter, do you understand me? After that proclamation, the rest of the meal is exceedingly silent. Percy finishes quickly, and then lingers awkwardly, sure his parents will ask to speak to him after the younger brood have disappeared into their respective rooms. Percy, a word, his father says. Percy practices what he's going to say. He's not going to start a fight, but if they ask him to move into the safe house, he'll say that he has his own life and he needs to be accessible from his flat for his job. Percy, we have something we need to ask you, Arthur says, before clearing his throat and looking at Marley. His mother looks at Percy with a look that would be more familiar on Ron's face. She purses her lips, swallows heavily, and then says, Albus would like us to ask you if you would be willing to use the Prewett inheritance for the order. Percy blinks at her, taken aback. What? As you know, since I am not a formal heir of the Prewett family, I cannot use any of the inheritance without Auntie Muriel's approval, and yours, now that she's named you as her heir, she says between clenched teeth. At one point, Aunt Muriel had suggested Percy and Marley go together to the vault. At one point, she claimed she was going to name Marley as her heir as well. Percy wonders what his mother said to stop Aunt Muriel from enacting that plan. And Dumbledore wants me to what? Fund this safe house. Not just the safe house, Percy, Arthur says. We spoke to you about the order last time, I believe. If he is back, Albus will need money for many things. And he's not got any other pureblood heirs to ask, I imagine, Percy says acidly. Tonks, perhaps, though her family gave up their claim to the House of Black. What about Sirius Black? His parents exchange a look. Sirius is already contributing quite a bit. It's quite too bad that the Weasleys chose not to focus on money, says Percy, his heart beginning to beat quickly and combatively in his throat. It would be nice if we had money to give to Dumbledore as soon as he asks, wouldn't it be? Percy, his mother begins admonishingly. No, Mother, you know it's true. You and Father will spend my entire life telling me not to value wealth, not to have ambition, to be content with our lot in life. and the moment your precious Dumbledore needs a few galleons to rub together, you'll completely change your tune. Do you even know what he's planning to do with the money? What exactly will he fund? Will I receive any sort of receipt? Do I get a say in how it's used? Perhaps it will be better if you arrange a time to speak with him, says Arthur. Marley stands. He shouldn't have to speak with Albus. A word should be enough for him. But if he's unwilling to use his new title to help his family, then there's nothing we can do. I am not a child, Mother. I can make my own decisions. And yet you insist on acting like one, his father says sharply, which for Arthur is nothing short of a biting admonition. He sighs and continues in a milder tone, Percy, you must be careful. I hear you are meeting regularly with the Malfoys. They are not to be trusted. Why do you hate Lucius Malfoy so much? Arthur sighs, pressing his fingers into the pads of his eyes on either side of his nose. You've asked me that before, Percy. I deserve to know, Percy insists. There are plenty of snobbish, wealthy, pureblood families. I went to school with all of their heirs. Why the Malfoys, specifically? Why must you always push, Percy? His mother snaps. Why can you not trust your father and I? You should not associate with the Malfoys. What else is there to it? I deserve to know, Percy repeats emphatically. I am an adult. I cannot rely on either of you any longer. I must make my own way in this world, build my own career, win my own respect. But you both seem insistent that I take your drama and grudges into my adult life, and I'm tired of it. Marley laughs, and it is both harsh and grating. Percy flinches. He's seen his mother like this before, but only infrequently. Ron and Fred and George and Ginny, Marley is strict but kind, liable to flick her kitchen towel at their legs or order them about but unlikely to take it any further. With Percy, and with Charlie and Bill too, she is sterner and stricter and at times much more volatile. Do you really want to know, Percy? Yes, of course. In another world you may have been Lucius Malfoy's child, Marley says viciously. Percy gapes at her and she smiles bitterly. Oh, yes. He was rather infatuated with me. Marley Prowett, young and wealthy. Oh, I was quite the catch, you see. Percy cannot help but swing his eyes to Arthur, who next to Lucius is as old and deflated as a bicycle tire left out in the snow. My friends thought I was mad, Marley continues. To throw away my chance to be Lady Malfoy, only to be Mrs. Weasley. You think you are the first to judge me, Percy, but you are hardly anything close. Why didn't you marry him? Percy bursts out. Lucius Malfoy is cruel, Percy, his mother says, and some of the combative light dims in her eyes. He is cruel, and he tries to take what he believes he is deserved with force if he must. Percy shivers. There is an entire world behind that sentence, and he is not entirely sure he wishes to uncover it. Your father is a good man. He is kind and strong and believes in all of us, Percy. You are like me, quick to act, quick to judge, and slow to regret. Percy tries not to think of himself as being like either of his parents, but he cannot bring himself to deny his mother as she stares at him proudly, her eyes glittering. I chose this family, and I would do it again and again if I had to, she says with an air of finality. I pray you make the same choice. His mother rises and walks silently out of the room. Arthur follows, not even pausing to give Percy an apologetic look. Percy sits on the couch, struck by the implications of what his mother said. To think Lucius Malfoy wanting to wed his mother. But it makes sense if he thinks on it further. He's seen photographs of his mother in school, young and bright and laughing and beautiful. To hear McGonagall tell it, his mother had been rather intelligent, taking extra tutelage and taking several difficult owl classes. And hadn't Marley told him she'd received an invitation to study dueling in France? She should have married Lucius. Although Narcissa Malfoy is lovely too, and undoubtedly quick and intelligent herself. Percy thinks of Narcissa and her porcelain smile in the quiet, gentle east parlor of her mansion, and can admit the clamor of the burrow suits his mother better. But nevertheless, the story of Lucius did nothing but distract him from the main indignities of the evening. The nerve of his parents to insinuate that he is betraying his family merely because he does not always agree to their demands without question. The absolute nerve of Dumbledore and his parents. It didn't escape Percy that he received neither an invitation to the safe house nor an invitation to join the Order. Dumbledore doesn't want him. He wants Percy's money. Well, he can't have it. As the Weasleys prepare to vacate the burrow for whatever passes for a safe house in the underfunded Order, Ron shoving socks into his trunk up until the last minute, Ginny burying all of her old diaries viciously in the backyard, Fred and George stretching the limit of shrinking charms, frantically reviewing Gibson's principle of layering charms on magical objects, and Arthur and Marley staring around them, each praying that they may one day return to this old and ramshackle house which holds all of their memories, to the bed where they willed each child into being, and the kitchen with the marks of each year's heights embedded into one wall. Percy is resolutely not there, spending his afternoons working on the curve of Tom's chin as his face slowly materializes into being.